Should Know, coming to you from Cambridge Community Television here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Today we are going to be speaking about bullying, economic, social, political, and with Paul Stephen Stone and Jay O'Connell. Paul Stephen Stone will begin, I believe, Paul, with an introduction about Orange Shield.
Okay. There's a program that I developed and we piloted at Randolph High School, and it's called Orange Shield. And essentially, if the school embraces the program, the school will get posters, giant banners that basically encourage the students to wear orange as a show, as a show of support for anybody that might be bullied, as a show that they're against bullying. It's taking a stand when they get dressed in the morning. So just putting on a pair of orange socks or orange sneakers, may ultimately be part of a movement to really kind of make bullying something that's no longer seen as socially acceptable. And it's hard to say anything that's successful because you have no idea the success you create in a high school with something like this. But I do think that my sister, who was the high school counselor, that basically under her aegis we brought it in, said that she got a lot of positive feedback from kids who had been, they were known victims of bullies. So that spoke well. And then I showed videos in the introductory assembly, one of which was my anti-bullying video called To You Who Are Different, which people can see. It's a 4.5-minute video on YouTube. So Orange Shield needs somebody like the Denver Broncos, somebody that's devoted to orange, to sponsor it nationwide. And it also needs schools that realize that this is the simplest program they could possibly institute. You don't have to spend a fortune on it. Unfortunately, I'm not making any money on it. So essentially, it's there to just be picked up. You'd have to create posters. You'd have to buy banners. But essentially, it's there to, it's basically turnkey.
Everybody buys their own socks and sweatshirt, right?
And then once the kids get started, yes, it has the potential for becoming multifaceted. If the kids take it and run with it, you also have the possibility of going into some sort of commercial endeavors, selling orange hats for Orange Shield, selling orange clothing of different sorts. But it's basically as cheap as you want to get to have a anti-bullying program. So anybody that wants to talk to me about that, I am available at paulstephenstone@gmail.com. paulstephenstone@gmail.com. If you have any interest, just mention that you heard about the Orange Shield program on What You Should Know, which is an internationally favored TV show, cable TV show. But that's essentially it. And if you know somebody that would be looking to sponsor a program, I mean, there's no reason why your company couldn't have its logo at the bottom of our posters and on our Orange Shield banners, which when we did it in Randolph High School, and it had the Orange Shield logo and tagline, which was "No more bullying, no more fear." And then we brought it down after the assembly to lunchroom, and hundreds of kids signed these banners. So we hung them up with all the kids basically given buy-in by signing it. It was nice. It was a real good program. And it is a real good program. So, and if anybody wants to take it over, I don't have the time to try to sell it to the world. I don't have the time to spend running around to different possible sponsors. I try to get United Stationers to, they have a school book catalog, school supply catalog, but they weren't interested, sadly.
Paul Stephen Stone and Jay O'Connell are both authors. They're both working, not at this moment, but they're both working presently on novels. Jay, would you like to say something about what you're working on?
I'm a science fiction writer, and I publish in Asimov's and Analog, these sort of science fiction magazines that have been around for 100 years or so. And I'm interested in the sort of the future of work and sort of the impacts of technology and automation, machine learning, AI on the next century of human of life on Earth. And this is sort of this nexus where a lot of political lines cross, and I think, you know, to a very real degree, the election of Donald Trump, Brexit, sort of the rise of these populist movements, these right-wing sort of know-nothing populist movements, are being fueled by the uncertainty and the fear of displacement via technological revolution that are occurring. So there are good futures that are foreseeable and plausible, and there are sort of monstrous dystopias that are more or less equally as likely. And so it's a wonderful, exciting time to be alive, and we're all going to see the world that we grew up in completely transformed, and it's going to be interesting times. So
thank you so much, Jay. And
Yeah.
I think at this point it's clear that the saying that the Chinese, that we've heard from the Chinese, may you live in interesting times, they only say this to their enemies. This has been my understanding of this Chinese.
The old Chinese curse idea.
Right.
Yeah, I've heard it's sort of racist to even say it's Chinese curse. It's not a Chinese curse. I've heard various things about you should live in interesting times. Regardless of who came up with it as an idea, it's sort of illustrative of how interesting things will be and will continue to be in the near term future.
It's true.
Yeah.
Well, you know, and the thing to keep in mind is that it keeps on moving along. Nothing stays the same. We've seen some really horrible things happen in the last year and a half, and if that's all we're going to see, we're in serious trouble. But and I'm somewhat optimistic. I think the human race chooses to survive when it has the choice. So I'm just hoping that when they break the system, it breaks enough that people will finally change it and put in something worth, you know, deferring to.
Yeah, a new progressive era sort of triggered by this sort of very risky future that we're heading into, and there's definitely this sense that a reckoning is coming, and the fact that, you know, a third of the American populace had voted for someone who had no coherent thought, no coherent ideology whatsoever. He was just a series of sort of random placating non sequiturs. So you have a guy that's for trickle-down taxation and who's against free trade. So regardless of whether you believe in free trade or fair trade, there's no sense in which Donald Trump can exist within the Republican Party without the Republican Party essentially admitting they have no ideals, they have no belief, they have no principles. And what everyone sort of thought might happen, I think, when he was elected, was that there would be some sort of allergic reaction. The immune system of the American politic would do something, and perhaps a lot of Republicans would coalesce with a few Democrats and a few Republicans would impeach him, and we get Pence, and we get a different set of nightmares based on him. But there was sort of this idea that, you know, certainly the center of the GOP wouldn't go along with, and then XXX put in all of the things that have happened, and we're still astonished. He has 84% approval amongst his base, amongst elected officials, not just his base. So we haven't reached a level of outrage that's sufficient to cause the Republicans to value their country over their party. So it's amazing, and every single time we get a new outrage, we're like, well, maybe this is when. We're waiting for that moment, that McCarthy moment.
The shoe to drop.
Yeah, we're waiting for that. Had you at long last no decency moment, and we keep thinking, do they at long last have no decency? And we're like, no.
That's exactly the point. That
not yet. It's coming though. Yeah, because it's going to come. Because there's no way it can't come.
That's precisely the point that I believe all three of the panelists today are looking at. And to put this forward, we are interested. Basically in an address by Noam Chomsky, maintaining that the most dangerous group in the history of the world is now in control of the United States. It's a 12-minute address, and we'd like to play this now. Thank you.
He looks like Big Brother, doesn't he?
It really does, and this doesn't change. He remains exactly that way. Nothing happens. to change this
camera?
position.
No.
The camera doesn't change, just his voice comes on.
That the Republican Party, you said, is the most dangerous organization in world history. Can you explain?
I also said that it's an extremely outrageous statement. But the question is whether it's true. I mean, has there ever been an organization in human history that is dedicated with such commitment to the destruction of organized human life on Earth? Not that I'm aware of. Is the Republican organization, I hesitate to call it a party, committed to that? Overwhelmingly. There isn't even any question about it. Take a look at the last primary campaign. Plenty of publicity. Very little comment on the most significant fact. Every single candidate either denied that what is happening, namely serious move towards environmental catastrophe, or there were a couple of moderate so-called, Jeb Bush, who said, maybe it's happening, we really don't know, but it doesn't matter because fracking is working fine, so we can get more fossil fuels. Then there was the guy who was called the adult in the room, John Kasich, the one person who said, yes, it's true, global warming's going on, but it doesn't matter. He's the governor of Ohio. In Ohio, we're going to go on using coal for energy, and we're not going to apologize for it. So that's 100% commitment to racing towards disaster. Then take a look at what's happened since. The November 8th was the election. There was, as most of you know, I'm sure, a very important conference underway in Morocco, Marrakesh, Morocco. Almost roughly 200 countries at the United Nations sponsored conference, which was the goal of which was to put some specific commitments into the verbal agreements that were reached at Paris in December 2015, the preceding International Conference on Global Warming. The Paris Conference did intend to reach a verifiable treaty, but they couldn't because of the most dangerous organization in human history. The Republican Congress would not accept any commitments, so therefore the world was left with verbal promises but no commitments. Well, last November 8th, they were going to try to carry that forward. On November 8th, in fact, there was a report by the World Meteorological Organization, very dire analysis of the state of the environment and the likely prospects. Also pointed out that we're coming perilously close to the tipping point which was the goal of the goal of the Paris negotiations was to keep things below that, coming very close to it, and other ominous predictions. At that point, the conference pretty much stopped because the news came in about the election. And it turns out that the most powerful country in human history, the richest, most powerful, most influential, the leader of the free world, has just decided not only not to support the efforts, but actively to undermine them. So there's the whole world on one side, literally, at least trying to do something or other. Not enough, maybe, although some places are going pretty far, like Denmark, a couple of others. On the other side, in splendid isolation, is the country led by the most dangerous organization in human history, which is saying, we're not part of this. In fact, we're going to try to undermine it. And we're going to maximize the use of fossil fuels, could carry us past the tipping point. We're not going to provide funding for, as committed in Paris, to developing countries that are trying to do something about the climate problems. We're going to dismantle regulations that retard the impact, the devastating impact of production of carbon dioxide and, in fact, other dangerous gases, methane, others. Okay, so the conference kind of pretty much came to a halt. It continued, but the question was, can we salvage something from this wreckage? And pretty amazingly, the countries of the world were looking for salvation to a different country, China.
7 minutes.
Here we have a world looking for salvation to China, of all places, when the United States is the wrecking machine that's threatening destruction, with all three branches of government in the hands of the most dangerous organization in human history. And I don't have to go through what's happened since, but in general, the cabinet appointments are designed to assign to people whose commitment and beliefs are that it's necessary to destroy everything in their department that could be of any use to human beings and wouldn't just increase profits and power. And they're doing it very systematically, one after another. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, has been very sharply cut. Actually, the main department that's concerned with environmental issues is the Department of Energy, which also had very sharp cuts, particularly in the environment-related programs. In fact, there's even a ban on posting and publishing information and material about this. And this is not just at the national level. The Republican Party, whatever you want to call it, has been doing this at every level. So in North Carolina, a couple of years ago, where the legislature, mostly thanks to gerrymandering, is in the hands of the Republicans, there was a study, they called for a study on the effect of sea level rise, on what sea level rise might be on the North Carolina coast. And there was a serious scientific study which predicted, I'll forget how many years, not a long time, about roughly a meter rise in sea level, which could be devastating to eastern North Carolina. And the legislature did react, namely by passing legislation to ban any actions or even discussion that might have to do with climate change. Actually, the best comment of this, wish I could quote it verbatim, was by Stephen Colbert, who said, if you have a serious problem, the way to deal with it is to legislate that it doesn't exist. Problem solved. You know, this is going on all over the country, and it's not just it's not simply climate change. That's bad enough, but there's another huge specter that we're kind of trying to survive under, and that's nuclear war. That's a whole other story. Here, both the Obama administration and increasingly Trump are radically increasing that danger. The threat of the of the new developments is captured very effectively in the best simple monitor of the state of the world, established at the beginning of the nuclear age by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. I'm sure you all know about this, but the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists regularly brings together a group of scientists, political analysts, others, very serious people, to try to give some kind of estimate of what the situation of the world is. The question is, how close are we to termination of the species? And they have a clock, the doomsday clock, and when it hits midnight, we're finished. End of the human species and much else. And the question every year is, how far is the minute hand from midnight? Well, at the beginning, in 1947, beginning of the nuclear age, it was placed at 7 minutes to midnight. It's been moving up and back ever since. The closest it's come to midnight was 1953. 1953, the United States and Russia both exploded hydrogen bombs, which are extremely serious threat to survival. Intercontinental ballistic missiles were all being developed. This, in fact, was the first serious threat to the security of the United States. There's an interesting story behind that, but I'll put it aside unless there's time to talk about it. But then it came to 2 minutes to midnight, and it's been moving up and back since. 2 years ago, 2014, I think it was, the analysts took into account for the first time something that had been ignored. The fact that the nuclear age, the beginning of the nuclear age, coincided with the beginning of a new geological epoch, the so-called Anthropocene. There's been some debate about the epoch in which human activity is drastically affecting the general environment. There's been debate about its inception, but the World Geological Organization has recently determined that it's about the same time as the beginning of the nuclear age. So we're in these two eras in which the possibility of human survival is very much at stake, and with us, everything else too, of course, most living things, which are already under very severe threat. Well, a couple of years ago, I think it was 2014, the bulletin began to take that into account and moved the minute hand up to 3 minutes to midnight, where it remained last year. About a week into Trump's term, the clock was moved again to 2.5 minutes to midnight. That's the closest it's been since 1953. And that means extermination of the species is very much an open question. I don't want to say it's solely the impact of the Republican Party. Obviously, that's false. But they certainly are in the lead in openly advocating and working for destruction of the human species. I agree, that's a very outrageous statement. So I therefore simply suggest that you take a look at the facts and see if it has any merit, or if it just should be bitterly condemned. That's up to you.
That's a horrific conclusion, and the statement Noam Chomsky just made 12 minutes on YouTube. We thank Noam Chomsky's organization, or Noam Chomsky personally, for the opportunity to play that here on our show today. But we've decided to comment basically from our own particular position on this, and Jay, you've agreed to go first.
Yeah, I mean, by and large, I agree with Noam Chomsky's assessment of the GOP as the most dangerous organization in the history of the human race. In terms of the existential risk of nuclear war to the human species, there have been massive reductions in our nuclear arsenal and the Soviet nuclear arsenal, and I think we're inching closer towards some sort of limited exchange of nuclear weapons, which will kill tens of millions of people. But we no longer are on the threshold of the complete destruction of the world by a USSR sort of full exchange. I think that's still, a ways away. And the degree to which Trump is or is not a puppet of the Russians is sort of part of that equation. North Korea, Israel, Pakistan, there are these players that have a few nuclear weapons. And it's important to remember that the United States spends more on its military than the next 7 countries combined. So the idea that there's any single country or any group of countries that in some sort of one-on-one confrontation could invade us or destroy us, it just doesn't exist. The real problem is that the money required to save the human race from climate change and any number of disasters is sort of trapped within our military-industrial complex. And our military-industrial complex is the largest company in the history of the species. It's the biggest company in the world. It's the biggest company that's ever existed. By and large, I agree with the Chomskyan assessment of where the GOP is now, and its climate change is hugely important, and it's something that even mainstream Democrats seem to think is a loser of an issue. And, you know, we're in this place, you know, it's strange, you know, when 9/11 happened, the right had legislation that they've been trying to ram through Congress since Watergate to increase the power of the presidency. And in the middle of the night, they ran through the Patriot Act, and they got what they wanted. And I feel like the environmental movement needs to articulate a broad vision for a sustainable future in a lot of legislation at state, local, and federal levels. And then we need to viciously exploit the next tragedy in the same way that the right exploited 9/11. And we have to be careful. We need to exploit the environmental tragedies, and we need to minimize the inevitable terrorist blips that are going to occur, that are going to be insignificant. Because the GOP will kick 23 million people off their health care, will kill 10 to 20,000 Americans a year. So, okay, Osama bin Laden in his wildest wet dream could not imagine killing that many American citizens. But the GOP has signed up to do this. So imagine a stadium where every minute you bring in a child and you put a gun to his head and you pull the trigger and his brains splatter and you just kill him. And you do it every minute for 3 days. That's 3,000 children. That's how many people our private healthcare system, how many children our private healthcare system kills every year now. and yet, you know, we're upset about this guy who has, you know, a box cutter and he could crack, you know, and at some point the American people have to sort of learn how to read graphs and look at numbers and think about what actually threatens them. And, you know, we have to get to a place where we can talk about single payer, we can talk about Medicare for all, we can talk about what sane and logical countries do about healthcare. And again, you know, if we look at our GOP versus conservatives in other countries, there are no conservatives in other countries that don't believe in climate change. The British conservatives believe in climate change. It's not even on the table. There are no conservatives in other countries that want to get rid of their national health care. If they have national health care, no one would dream of getting rid of it. It's just, how could you do that? You couldn't just kill millions of people. So our conservatives are qualitatively different than conservatives anywhere else in the world. And they're just insane. And the reason they're insane is our Democratic Party adopted every sane conservative policy. So our Democrats now are centrist Republicans from the 50s and 60s. There is no left. We are ruled by a center-right government. And the Republican Party is a series of nonsensical, incoherent, rhetorical, Pyrrhic opinions about things that when you try to turn them into policy, just turn into disaster. So, you know, so they couldn't even allow the Congressional Budget Office to score their plan. Because if they'd scored it, they couldn't have voted for it. So the answer was, don't score it. Just say something about it. So, you know, we're in this very weird place where there's a party and a president, and nothing they say means anything. It's like Seinfeld, the show about nothing. The GOP is now a party about nothing. There's nothing that they say that they actually mean, except for tax cuts.
Jay, thank you so much for that. That's really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And I think that's that expresses my opinion as well. But before I can come to word, perhaps.
What do I have to add to that? There are a number of things that I constantly find myself taken aback by, and one of them is how you could, in the face of irrefutable evidence and mounting evidence, and 97% of the scientific community supporting a point of view, how you can argue against it because you say you don't believe. Who gives a shit what you believe? The truth of the matter is we're talking about the survival of the human race. Why would you ever put that into question? Why would you ever act in any way that might substantiate the 97% that say we're going to screw ourselves up and kill ourselves? So that whole thing is just, it defies belief. The governors that actively deny, one of them is Rick Scott down in Florida.
Oh yeah.
And you can walk through Miami, sections of Miami that are underwater during the day.
Yeah.
And he won't let his state government use the term climate change.
Yeah.
I mean, what is the story with us? We're absolutely crazy. And this will go on for as long as as long as people politically protect these people that are destroying the quality of life and the potential for living. It's just beyond belief. So what do we need? We need somebody to stand up to it with a voice that has no moral equivalency. Nobody that's already basically decided that they'll get along and go along. You need somebody with certain standards of morality that's impeccable, and that person has to start articulating, just like Chomsky did. Chomsky is brilliant, but he's not particularly charismatic. And you need somebody to capture people's imaginations right now. And that's not happening. Because everybody that's speaking up, Schumer closed his eyes when Bernie got pushed out of the way for the nomination. Everybody in that Democratic Party has basically been tainted from their association with the Democrats. So you're really in a very weird place right now. You've got somebody that seems to be a master manipulator, keeping people totally off guard. They don't know where to put up the wall next, because this guy is a moving target. He will strike wherever wherever the hell he chooses to strike, and they don't know what to expect. Neither does his own people. So you've got somebody that I think, even in terms of mental health, should be taken out of that office.
Yeah.
And that may be ultimately how we get rid of him, but
Yeah.
it's just not a safe situation.
Well, the New York Times is now saying that that there are GOP senators that are beginning to distance themselves, and so you have people that have sort of long political careers, that are thinking about more than 2 and 4 years in the future. People that want to be there for I guess decades, and so some of them are beginning to discover that they can not be critics, but they can sort of hang back a little bit. So there's this beginning of what will have to happen within the Republican Party to do something about Trump, and but mostly we're just horrified. There's that piece in the Times about 84 is the only number you need to know about this administration to understand that there is no impeachment on the short-term horizon, because 84% is the support that Trump's base gives him. And it's reflected in 84% of the legislators essentially lining up behind him as well. And it's important to realize what they get for supporting Trump. And there's just one thing, and it's tax cuts. And this is a party with one idea and one issue, and it's just destroy the government. It's just the government's small enough to strangle. Everything else is negotiable. He can abuse women, he can abuse veterans, he can abuse the presidency, he can lie, he can say the Constitution is overrated, he can, anything. There's nothing that he could do that will essentially peel off a bunch of GOP people horny for a tax cut. And we didn't know this till now. We thought at some point that they might also care about the Constitution, and they might also care about, a multicultural, multi-ethnic sort of degree of fairness. There's all these ideas we could have thought about the Republican Party before Trump. And every day it's just this nauseating discovery of just the depths to which they will sink. And they won't stand up to him. They won't stand up to these things they say in any meaningful way. So the good news is that he doesn't seem to have any kind of bottom. So it seems like he's going to get there eventually. So his public statements about the Comey firing, in which he's essentially laid out a strong case for the obstruction of justice. He demanded a loyalty oath. He fired a person who was in charge of an investigation into his own criminal behavior and his own administration's criminal dealings with the Russians. And then he supposedly taped it. He said he taped it all. Apparently Trump is a guy who does this. He tapes people. So these three components sort of transform him into this Nixonian figure. And the question is whether or not some investigation will be able to subpoena these tapes, whether they exist or not. And so we begin to see how it could come apart. but we're waiting for sort of that supposedly centrist Republican, that supposedly career Republican that believed in more than just tax cuts in one budget.
And then gets the ball rolling to an impeachment.
Those Republicans have been chased out of the party.
They have. Jay,
Olympia Snow is maybe the last one, or
Who?
the
Olympia Snow?
Maine. Yeah. She was decent.
The point you made,
Susan
Jay,
Collins.
is
Susan Collins, yeah.
extremely accurate. And Professor Wolf of the University of Massachusetts, I believe in Boston, has a piece on YouTube basically about the economics of the Republican Party. And it's a scathing critique. It goes to the moral equivalency of, as Jay O'Connell just mentioned, there is no moral sentiment, there's no moral basis for the Republican Party, apparently, in their efforts to placate and play to the individuals, the billionaires financing their campaigns. It's important that we recognize.
Yeah, I was going to add that. The 1%
Right.
can't be forgotten in all this.
Right. The if someone is elected to Congress, after 1 year, it may only be 6 months, they have a pension, they have health care the rest of their lives, they're in financial security. There is no reason for an individual with any ethical or moral standard after 6 months to continue to support a regime which actually, according to Chomsky and according to both of my guests here, has no moral basis to support at all. As a matter of fact, the discussion which Professor Wolf brings forward, Professor Wolf from University of Massachusetts again, is that the degree of amorality within the business class of the United States is absolutely astounding. There seems to be no moral basis whatsoever for their decisions. That's the business class. We're not speaking about the political class. The business class makes decisions from a business point of view. The decisions they make are completely unethical. They have no basis in providing any good whatsoever for the population. The only good they have is in their decision making apparently is for themselves and for their shareholders. This includes Warren Buffett. This includes any of the financial elements, the financial leadership. But my question in this goes back to the two universities at both ends of the street running by the front of the studio. MIT at one end, Harvard at the other end. Two incredibly important institutions of higher learning. One of them, the technical institution, the other, the business institution. The professorship of each and separately would have the moral standing and professional standing to critique the Republican Party, to critique what's going on politically and ethically, and seriously impact the public opinion on what's happening. There's complete silence, both from MIT in reference to global warming, in which a technical university that comes out and clarifies seriously the ramifications of global warming, how it would come about, the ramifications of it long term, and the fact, as Chomsky mentioned, it's a doomsday machine. We are very close to the turning point in this, and still nothing is being undertaken. MIT is definitely carries a responsibility from my point of view in this. The other end is Harvard Business School, who, according to the information that I've heard discussed, configured and brought about the algorithms used for the stock manipulation, which led to the subprime mortgage meltdown. Whether or not that's true, perhaps sometime in the future, that will be decided. My opinion on this is we have a complete absence of any moral standing in the business community, in the technical community, in the political community, and for the last point of this, in the professional community.
But you know, one of the things that's happened is that you've seen government running amok. You know, you've seen Loretta Lynch meeting with Bill Clinton 3 days before Hillary's exoneration is announced. You don't have any more faith left in those institutions. And you know, you talk about the New York Times article. I don't believe the New York Times. The New York Times has been such a slut when it comes to news in the last year and a half, printing what they want and sleeping with whomever they want and not sleeping with whomever they don't want. They've not been reporting the news accurately and fairly.
I think they've been, you know, they're a mixed bag. I think that there's still an institution worthy of our support. I wrote them a letter about this climate denier, the columnist that they've hired recently, saying one more and I'll cancel my subscription. But you know, I'm still subscribing because they're better than Breitbart.
No, that's true. But what's out there
better
is
than Fox. It's
right.
better than Breitbart, and but it's just
I'm just
it
saying
is
that
frustrating.
I'm saying that credibility has shrunk dramatically.
Well,
I've
I
read
remember
them
when
twice.
they came out for the Iraq War. They I
Right.
remember when they fell down and pooped in their pants over the Iraq War,
And they gave Hillary a free ride.
And yeah, they're more or less we're okay with Hillary.
When people started to question the exit polls, they had one of their columnists debunk exit polls as a way of reporting, you know, what was happening in the primaries.
you know,
So I have to say, you know, I agree with you. It's probably the best of a bad bunch,
yeah.
but that doesn't say a lot about. In the old days, you had Walter Cronkite, you had Eric Severide, you had Newman, whatever his name was. You had people whose integrity you felt you could trust.
Murrow.
And we've lost. Yes.
Yeah,
Ed Murrow.
Murrow.
But-
yeah, I mean the center has moved and it continues to move. There's a column now in the New York Times called "Say Something Nice About Donald Trump," and no one can tell whether it's ironic or whether it's just sort of like, I mean, it's just, you know, they're floundering. We're in this very weird place now where to be truthful is to sound utterly partisan. And it's a weird place to be in, where there's really nothing you can say about the GOP that's hyperbole.
Right.
And it sounds like hyperbole.
Right.
I mean,
I agree.
and I hear my own people saying things that I agree with and I believe in. Some part of me is like, nah, I'm tired of hearing that. I mean, it's so depressing and so dark. But I mean, in terms of the complete bankruptcy of the entire business community, this MIT course I'm taking now on sort of labor relations and the future of work does talk about, you know, these sort of a few bright spots.
Thank you.
You know, Costco and Market Basket. The Market Basket experience here was an amazing thing.
Amazing.
You had an affordable grocery and you know, serving a population, treating its employees better than average, and it was seen as ripe for predation by someone that wanted to come in and
Right.
create, you know, something horrible.
Was already in.
Yeah,
Somebody was already in.
And the entire workforce quits, you know, goes on strike, and the people that who shop there stop shopping there. They have to shop somewhere else, and eventually they are able to retain their leadership and sort of keep a hold of what they built there.
Right.
So
It's a wonderful example. Thank you.
there's a handful of high road businesses out there. In '93, there was a change in sort of our understanding of what a corporation was. And prior to the 90s, it was understood that a corporation had other values other than shareholder value, and that it created jobs and it was a public good. And the thinking changed tremendously as this sort of World War II era people that had been educated with the GI Bill at the Harvard Business School, who went on during, you know, the Greatest Generation to create the broadly shared prosperity that existed from the 50s through the 70s, when worker salaries rose with productivity. And then this sort of kind of monstrous world from the 90s forward, and apparently there was some work done at Harvard about valuing stock options and using them as CEO compensation. And so people were really excited about this sort of theoretical work about stock options, and it became sort of like the idea that shareholder value was the only measure of a corporation's value became ubiquitous. And this is the thing that's the sort of the acid that has eroded everything since then. And so, you know, the combination with NAFTA is a massive offshoring, massive disruption. So the hope amongst the sort of centrist MIT people that I've spoken to in labor relations is that there would be a way to take efforts at the state and local levels, the best business practices of high road businesses, and somehow spread them wider throughout the culture.
Thank you, Jay, and I agree completely. I don't mean to say that there is no one in business or no one studying business that would actually make an effort to develop a concept which benefits the people. What I'm saying is that the leadership potential for both MIT and Harvard is massive, and their use of this renommee is negligible. And the problem with that is a problem that Germany between 1933 and 1945 actually exemplified for the entire world. Unfortunately, the United States drafted all of the Nazis out of the collapsing Third Reich and put them to work in the CIA, basically to develop concepts to sabotage communist Russia. The Nazis in the government, in the CIA, do not only hold the idea of sabotaging Russia, however, and that may be part of the problem as to how this extreme concept, this right-wing, deeply entrenched anti-humanist bent, not only on the CIA from 1945 through 2017 came about, but I'll rest my case there.
Well, we're at a place where the ends apparently justify the means, and I take the market basket example.
Yeah.
You had a company that was successful, making a lot of money, and at the same time was incredibly good to its people.
Good for its employees and its shoppers at the same time.
Right. And that became something that was under attack because shareholder value was the issue.
There was more money to be extracted from
Right.
the investing class, and that had to be taken away from workers, that had to be taken away from
Right.
shoppers.
The good guys won in this case, but I would probably submit that more cases than not, they don't.
Oh, no, and it's not. What's interesting is that my professor is actually New Perez, the labor leader who's now the head of the DNC, and I, as a Bernie guy, was deeply suspicious of him, anyone that was associated with Hillary. And he told us to sort of give Perez a shot, that he had his own beliefs. He contacted this MIT professor and said, you know, tell me about the market basket case. And then they flew the employee leaders down to Washington to talk with them about what had worked in that case and what could be learned from this going forward in terms of a stronger position for labor at the negotiating table in sort of the future. And you know, we're in this era in which technological transformation of the culture makes a lot of traditional union ideas sort of very difficult to implement, very difficult to.
The unions haven't figured out where they should be. They really haven't.
Well, there's no way. It's very hard to respond to things like Uber and things like Airbnb and things like, there's this whole wave of disruptive technologies emerging from Silicon Valley based on the internet and peer-to-peer exchanges, and we don't know what the end game is for these things at all. And we know that they're resistant to government regulation, and they're disruptive. And so this course, The Future of Work, that I'm taking, which I really am enjoying, talks about a renegotiated social contract between management and labor and government that for the 21st century that needs to be developed.
I can completely concur with that. However, the question at hand, according to Chomsky and according to climate scientists, is not whether or not labor relations can improve. The question is whether or not the planet the human species will continue.
Right.
While I completely appreciate the quality of this course at MIT, I would mention the fact that the priorities have been set and completely neglected, not only by the business community, by the scientific community, in the exception perhaps of the course mentioned, because the renommee to demand a change from the politicians, to demand a change, to implement climate protective measures is being neglected, and the consequence of that, if that goes on for another 6 or 7 years, the consequence could be...
the perfidy and evil of the GOP can't be overstated. I mean, there was this conversation that occurred in sort of the idea of how to regulate greenhouse gases, and there were these ideas that came from the right, that came from sort of the business leaders. And the idea was to create a carbon market, and this would give us the flexibility of the market. It wouldn't be a heavy-handed government just saying, you do this, and you do this, and you do this. And, you know, I've struggled with that because I knew carbon markets would be gamed. There would be a lot of, you know, rich people getting richer. You know, I struggled with it, but I kind of decided in the end, you know what? This is the way that we do it. If this is the way we get everyone on board with it, it could work. You know, we could figure out how to do it. And then the devil's in the details. And, you know, how many zillions of pounds are grandfathered in, and how we'll have to work on it. And the second, you know, they have control of all branches of government, it's just, what? No, it's like, what is your idea? Well, what to say it's not happening now? And so, you know, we had carbon markets as this idea of a way to be flexible, to allow innovation in a lot of different realms. So there's, you know, the pieces are in place, and policymakers and scientists did work it out, and there was a negotiated deal in place, and the GOP and the American conservatives just did this thing that no one thought they would do, which is to basically say, we don't believe in science anymore.
Right.
And it was just astonishing, because it's just sort of like, well, why do you go to doctors? Can you just go to witch doctors, or, you know, just pray or something? Some of them are like that, but I mean, you know, it's like, why do you believe in anything? Why do you turn the car in your ignition? Electricity is a conspiracy. You know, like what, you know, it's like 90% of this profession, we're going to say, climate scientists, you know, whatever, it's 93, you know, we're going to say that they're all in on it because they were in for that big ecology money, like, you know, studies of the environment, we're gonna make them really rich, you know. It's like, because that's where you go if you want to make money, not Wall Street, but go into studying the climate. There's a gold mine for you, and they believe this, and they say, oh, it's all a conspiracy, and it's just, what? So the entire Republican Party now is wearing this tinfoil hat,
right,
and they don't believe in science anymore. And everyone, the entire world says, really? Is that going to work? Are they going to stick with that? And by gum, they have. And so there's we're in this very weird moment, and it feels like that moment right before we go the other way, right before we tell Joseph McCarthy to take a hike, that we're not going to do that anymore. You know, and it's felt like that, and it's felt like that though for like a long time, and it keeps not being that. And we keep looking for every new outrage. Is this the moment where people wake up and think? And the trouble is, there's just too many dislocations happening at once. You have the middle class that's being eroded by, trade deal is the boogeyman. It's all the trade deal. It was mostly technology. NAFTA was a wash. It screwed people, and we should have spent more money retraining, and we should have put more money into those devastated communities. The Democratic Party was culpable in not doing what it should have done to make that better. But 90% of the jobs that were lost because of technology. It had nothing to do with NAFTA.
Well, let's talk about for a second. There's a boycott, I don't know if you know it, of Wendy's. A national boycott of Wendy's because they refuse to pay fair price to the people that pick their tomatoes. That supposedly is
in Florida, right? Whatever, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's in Florida. I mean, in terms of where the flashpoint might be, yeah. But who supports that? I mean, when Chavez was out there, I mean,
Yeah.
he had national support. The Democrats were on his side. AFL-CIO was on his side, or at least it took a while, but they got there.
Yeah.
It's like this thing is existing in a vacuum. That people don't even know how to deal with trying to fight for people's rights.
Yeah, well, just the discrediting of the labor movement at the end of, when we were teenagers, and, the Vietnam War, where the labor unions were silent or on the side of this corrupt, horrible war, and there were a million ways in which the labor movement sort of lost sort of the center of the zeitgeist, and nothing ever really rose up to take its place to fight for median income, fight for the
Well, maybe you got to go right back to the work. When people were being totally abused and they were working long hours for no money at all. That may be ultimately the only place you're going to start to see somebody revolt.
Yeah, well, that's the whole. It has to get worse before it gets better idea.
Right.
And I've generally been trying to find some sort of a win-win always, and I think that's the trouble with all. I'm more of a centrist Democrat. There's always this sort of ever rightward tilt that occurs as we try to find some sort of pathway to a progressive and sustainable future that doesn't involve millions of people dying, and so it's we're now in a place where both left and right are sort of accepting the idea that millions of Americans are going to die.
This is not a pleasant moment in our show, but this has got to be the end of our show, unfortunately, from the time. Gio, Carl, thank you ever so much. Do you have the last word?
I do. I think one of the things that we have to really keep an eye out for is that there's a level at which the drums of war start to sound, and you don't necessarily know where it's coming from. Hillary was sounding that. The Democrats are sounding that. They're using Russia as a means. Who the hell wants to go to war with Russia? A lot of people do.
A lot of people want to go to war with Russia, and this is probably one of the problems. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Going to war with Russia seems to be on everybody's radar. We'll be talking about that next week. Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.